Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 421 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. This week on the show, we are wrapping up our More Than a Maker series, looking at the intersection of creativity and mental health. This week, we talk with Michael McCarthy, who is a potter and instructor at the Austin Riggs Center, which is a residential psychiatric hospital in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. In our interview, we talk about creativity within the mental health treatment paradigm, how decreasing expectation can lead to creative breakthroughs, and his own path to being a potter. If you'd like to see examples of his work, you can go to his website. That's McCarthyPottery.com. Also wanted to throw a plug out there for our new 10th anniversary merch. We've got new t-shirts, a new poster, as well as enamel pins and water bottles. If you'd like to support the show, this is a great way to do it. And you can shop directly on the website. That's talesofaredclayrambler.com. Also wanted to mention we're going to have a special 10th anniversary live episode that will be recorded via Zoom that you are all invited to. We're still working out the details for that, but that should be happening in July. So I look forward to posting more about that on Instagram at Carter Pottery or again at the website, which is talesofaredclayrambler.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about your work at the Austin Riggs Center. How did you come to work there and what do you do?
So I teach ceramics at the Austin Riggs Center, which is a private residential psychiatric hospital in Western Massachusetts and in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. So I teach ceramics. I teach working with clay, basically. So however people want to approach working with clay is what we do. So if people want to make an object, we can work with various ways in object making. If people want to learn a technique, I just try to stay kind of as open as possible to whatever it is that my students want to do. Most of the people that I work with, which I think is true for a lot of adults, everyone at the Austin Riggs Center is over the age of 18. And, most people haven't worked with clay since elementary school or like a summer camp. So the majority of the people that I work with are beginners, which for me is great. I don't teach in a classroom setting. I teach with one-on-one instruction. So if you want to work with me, you are going to make an appointment and we'll work together and I can really kind of cater to whatever it is that person wants to do. But then simultaneously, I'm running a studio. I run as much of a real world studio as I can. So people can come and go on their own and work whenever it kind of suits their schedule or what their, needs and desires are to work in the studio. So if you were my student and you were working with me, you may have you'd have an appointment to work with me, but there might be other people in the studio as well at the same time. So it's really, it's a great way to be able to teach. I've certainly taught like beginning throwing classes or, introductory to ceramics with 12 plus people. And it's hard for everybody. So yeah, it's really nice to be able to work in this way and to work with the material in this approach of like, well, what do you want to do? So also the fact that it's not a classroom, it's not like you've signed up for an 8-week or a 10-week class. And so that can provide people a lot of freedom. It can also kind of take some stresses away of having to maintain a schedule, which might be hard for some people. So
yeah, how long are people usually at the center?
So usually for a minimum of 6 weeks, that's the shortest stay. And that's based on what the treatment plan is. And then people can stay for quite a while. So people can stay for a year or a year plus. And so I get to work with people for a long time, which is a really nice way to be able to make a student instructor relationship. So we can get pretty involved. So our studio is small. It's the smallest studio in the building. So there's a fiber art studio, there's a wood shop, there's a visual art, so a painting and drawing studio, and there's actually also a theater. And so ceramics is kind of the smallest, but we get a lot done. It's a very active studio. And we have in the basement, I have a full glaze lab. I have a gas kiln. So I'm really lucky in the equipment that I've been able to kind of put together. I've been here for 13 years. So I try to give, as much of an in-depth ceramics instruction as people want. I certainly have my weaknesses, which I don't say self-deprecatingly, but that can also be a great opportunity for people to, kind of work on their own to kind of find some solutions to some of their projects and things they want to do. But yeah, we can, I have people who've never touched clay before and end up, delving into making their own glazes and firing a gas kiln. So it's really, I feel really lucky and how I'm able to teach. And the other side of that is it doesn't have to be that intense if you don't want it to be. And that's not a level of, one approach being better than another. So, so I'm able to really hopefully try to facilitate a lot of different kind of people's approaches at the same time. So, and that's going to happen with any group studio, but that's a real focus of mine is to try to accommodate people at their different levels, from somebody who's just walking in for the first time to a student I've been working with for many years.
How many patients are in the overall hospital?
The maximum census is 62, and that is a variety of programs. When you first come to Riggs, you live here for a minimum of 6 weeks, and then there are what's called outer programs. I mean, the idea is for you to leave. And so there's a lot of different kind of resident programs to help facilitate that. And there's different support within each program. So when you're first here, you're going to live on campus. And then there's some other programs where you can live on campus, but in a way where you have more independence. And then you can actually be a day patient here. So because of that, people can stay for longer. So yeah, there's a variety of approaches to what treatment you're in. And
when I was doing research on this, I noticed that there is a philosophy behind the activities program in general. In part of it, and in fact, I'm going to read some words back to you.
Okay, great.
This is what you wrote in an article for Studio Potter. Making art is not a privilege that patients have to earn, but instead patients can start working with me at any time after being admitted. This arrangement follows the belief that action in any form may promote growth, and as such, actions hold more possibility than passivity. So can you talk about that, this idea that productivity can engage growth, not necessarily like I'm going to be a better artist growth, but that it will help the person evolve in some way that might be beneficial to them?
Yeah, so the department, it's called the activities program, which I actually tried to get the name changed because it sounded a little hokey. And I think just the word activities has kind of gotten a bad rap over the years, but it's about action. It's similar. It's about what you just read. And so, hopefully through action, hopefully you're able to take some action. Right. That's the first step, because it can be really hard for some people who, if they're not necessarily at the best point in their life, right? They've been hospitalized for a reason. Usually I don't know what that reason is. But coming down here can be an act of courage, really, to walk down here. And what I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to do something you don't know how to do. So you're already in a place which is vulnerable, and I'm asking you to take this action, which might be a real risk, but hopefully there's some reward in it. And that reward for me isn't about what you make. It's just the fact that you're able to make anything. And Yeah, so that's kind of the thinking. And also realizing too, it can be really fun in the ceramic studio. And we all know it can be really amazingly frustrating in the ceramic studio. So, it might show you some of the things about yourself that are the hardest. Like those things may be revealed. And that, I hope there's both an awareness of that and also the fact that this can be a really enjoyable, in my opinion, action. And hopefully in a setting that's comfortable and social, and there's a good group of people working down here. So I know for me that I usually feel better when I have something going on in the studio than when I don't.
And I think too, it's concrete, meaning that there is a tactile experience that you're engaged with clay, which can be, I think, grounding when you're also dealing with mental stress or psychiatric issues. I know I've been to tons of counseling in my life, and sometimes I leave a counselor having a feeling that I might feel better, but I'm also kind of confused about what we even just talked about, But with clay, it's not like that. Like I'm engaged with the process in a way that makes me feel embodied, which I think can be really important.
Yeah. Kevin Coleman, who's the theater director here, who is an amazing director, and he's also really good at making fun of me. I think that's his other job. But I had a student who thanked me for not making her put any value into the object other than the value of the object herself. And, Kevin kind of likes to rib me about that a little bit because, isn't that the opposite of art? And not necessarily. So yes, I think there's a lot of different values of objecthood. And this working in this way can offer maybe different answers for the questions of why do we make, which as makers, I think we all ask ourselves this question of like, why are we making? And so I think one of the answers is to what you're speaking to. So an object, it can be a marker in time. It can be a way to get out of your head and use your body. And it can also just be about the object that you're making. And it can be about that. And it can allow you to, I keep using the word just, but to kind of just make an object and be happy with that.
When people become hospitalized, they usually, there's kind of two paths in my experience. You can voluntarily go, or you could be submitted by a family member through, I actually don't know what it's called in Massachusetts, but in other states it's called the Baker Act. Like essentially you're committed against your will. How many, or even do you know how many of the students that come into the studio are there voluntarily and are seeking help versus that maybe their parents or someone in their life has put them into the institution?
Yeah, so people are here voluntarily. Riggs is not it's not a locked unit. There's no forced meds, so it's everything is voluntary, including working with me. Or with any of us in the activities program. It's up to the patients to decide whether or not they want to do this. And then within that, hopefully if they want to do it, that they're able to do it. That doesn't answer the question of influence, right? I'm not talking about family influence. That's different. But yes, people are here voluntarily, which also is they're entering a contract that they are going to be able to be here voluntarily, and what that means. So, but the idea of when I work with patients at the Austin Riggs Center, I refer to them as my student because they are not my patient. I don't work here in a clinical capacity. I don't have clinical training. And Joan Erickson, who founded the program, she founded an art program where, in her opinion, the best way to teach art is if you have working artists as teachers. And this was in the time of the emergence of art therapy. And so the program she started was a little bit in response to art therapy. I don't have any issues with art therapy. It's just not what I do. I'm not an art therapist. And the philosophy of this program is that it's like, well, if you want to teach art, we're going to start with art because that's going to make better art. That's our jumping point.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I'm interested in voluntary care or involuntary care is that when you show up to hospitalization, you're asking for help. There's some sense of self-care. It's initiating a process of self-care. So I'm also interested in your thoughts on making as self-care, because I hear potters talk about this a ton as I interviewed them, is that making is one of the ways that I deal with my emotions. It's one of the ways I take care of myself. Like I wish I could recall an interview to mind, but I think that there are many, many potters that make with this orientation.
Yeah, so that is not my starting point also. That is up to my students, because it's not for me to impose that on them. That's for them to decide. I'm here to teach them how to work with clay. And then what they do with that and what philosophy they want to do with that, that's theirs. Yeah, so it's important for me to maintain that boundary. Yeah, again, that label of student is important, just as is the label of instructor. They don't want me to be their therapist. That would be awful, right? That would be dangerous, really. It would be dangerous. Sure. And I benefit from the fact that I know where I work. So I know that my students are hospitalized. So that can be helpful because they don't have to tell me why they're hospitalized. They don't. But it can free up some space in their mind. They don't have to hopefully act or feel like they have to act a certain way. They don't have to hide in plain sight. So that can be kind of freeing. And then I have the support of a hospital. I have the support of the therapists, of their social workers. And that is how I feel like I work with my coworkers, so I don't actually interact with every day physically, because where I work, it's actually down the street. It's off the grounds of the hospital. And that, again, is for a reason to make this program be like a real world art studio. Yeah, so I let my students decide what their process is for them.
Yeah, what a wonderful thing to give them space in that way. And I'm impressed that you can reduce your expectation. I went to school for education, and one of the things was about how do you establish expectation in the classroom, and then that expectation guides the student. And a lot of what you're saying is that actually we don't even have to do that. Let's put that to the side, and let's make a space where you can work with the material and let your relationship be yours with the material.
Yeah. What is the expectation that I see of most of my students? Perfection, right? Which is true with most beginners. And it's also true with the world that we live in. Like, our aesthetic value is 10 steps ahead of our hand skills when we're beginners, right? We know. So, and a lot of times what we want is realism. And so when you're a beginner, you're going to get a lot of failed realism. And so that doesn't make you a failure, right? So it's just that you have the skill sets that you have right now, which a lot of times are incredibly appropriate. Like, you have the right skill set for somebody who just did this for their first time or has done this for a week. So I try to reinforce that instead of, the perfectionism, which I think is common with every instructor. This is not unique to me. Maybe my students have a little bit more perfectionism. I don't know, but I don't think I'm unique in what I'm working with in regards to expectation.
What proportion of the day would the student be able to spend with you or spend in the studio versus doing other clinical treatments?
So it's up to them. Usually when people are here, I keep talking about this first 6 weeks. That's like a marker in their treatment. And so usually after that 6 weeks, their schedule can open up a little bit more. I think also they can feel that how do I say this? I think they can give themselves some more permission after the first 6 weeks than sometimes people do during the first 6 weeks. So it's partly based on their schedule. It's partly based on how much they want to engage with other things, but they can spend their entire day with me. They can spend their entire day with any of the instructors here. Which if they're going to do that all the time, that's probably going to get addressed, not necessarily by us, but, if they're spending all day and not doing other things, and, the other reason of being called a student is part of the philosophy of Riggs is, if you're only a patient, you're only going to act within that role. If you're a student, you're also a community member. If you have these three different kind of titles, you have these three different allowances in a way of the person that you are, which is like the idea is that you're going to be yourself here, and then that can get looked at, as opposed to only living within one role, which you may feel is constraining. So people can spend a lot of time with me, which is great, and people can spend a lot of time at the Lavender Door or the shop. That's the building that I work in. Which is great. And we have a program where they can sign the key out when staff isn't here. And, it's the thinking that we all experience as artists is like, well, we want to work when we want to work. And sometimes that might not be from 9 to 5 on, Monday through Friday. So yeah, we have a program where that is an earned privilege, where students can, earn the ability to sign the key out. And the reason why that's earned is just, we want to, safety is an issue, and we just want to make sure that safety is adhered to. But yeah, so that's like wonderful, and people will come in on the evenings or come out on the weekends, and they don't, students, it's like, you don't want to be around your instructor all the time. Like, it's like you want the studio to yourself, like, get out of my way. So yeah, so that's a program that is definitely utilized, and it's great to be able to offer that, and let the students become as independent as they possibly can be.
How many students do more than one medium? Like, they'll do fibers and theater and clay.
People who are here, the longer people are here, the more they kind of delve in. So there's a student here now who's worked in every studio, including the theater. We just last week they did a public performance of Midsummer Night's Dream. The theater did. There's also a lot of what's great about the fact that you're not taking a workshop or you're not taking a structured class is you can bounce from studio to studio, or again, without this feeling that you need to do this 10-week thing before you can go work in another studio. And you can also, like, the best way in my opinion of finding out whether or not you like something is by doing it. And people are able to do that. Students are able to do here. They're able to try it, see what it's like to actually do it. And if it's for them, great. If not, then they can do something else. So I don't have a great answer, but certainly some people will only work in one medium. Like, I have some students who only work in clay, and then other students so maybe half and half, where they work in multiple studios.
What feedback do you get from students as they're getting ready to depart the program? Like, they've gotten what they need and they're going to leave.
I think it's really hard to leave. It's hard to leave. I remember my first art studio, which was I learned how to make pots out in Truro, Mass, out in Castle Hill Center for the Arts. And I feel like I still try to recreate that. I mean, it's slight nostalgia, definitely. But I love that place, and I haven't been there. I don't know. I don't think I've been there in like 20 years. But it was my first art studio. And so it's hard for people to leave, even though they also are ready to leave, because it's a small space. If you've been here for a while, and you are really, you're really becoming proficient, it can be hard to share the studio sometimes with somebody who's new, or you want more space, you're just trying to do your thing. So there can be those conflicting desires where it's time, that you kind of need your own space. And it's sad to leave the camaraderie, the support, not just from the instructors, but from the other students at the shop, the social interaction. So yeah, it can be hard to leave. And The other thing that I hear sometimes is from people who have left, which I find amusing, is that they tell me the things that they weren't able to hear, even though I said them. And it just takes that distance for whatever, lesson or technique or stubbornness, which isn't to say I'm always right. I mean, I am not at all. And I learn a lot from my students, especially the things that they want to explore. I mean, that's the other great thing about working individually is that what do you want to do? And a lot of times I have no idea how to do that. I have never done that before. And if you're patient and we work together, let's figure it out. So that can be a real nice camaraderie of working. But those are the two. I would say those are the things that I hear a lot from students is just or witness, just how hard it is to actually leave, and then talking to people afterwards. And some people have gone on to make pots, which is awesome. It's not, again, that's not my goal. My goal is for you to just do something that you might not have otherwise done. In a place in your life where it might be hard to do that, but in my opinion, and again, that's for them to decide, I think it's going to be something that's going to be better for you to do than to not do.
How do you think this model could be applied in other places? Because I think in the article you had written that you said that this is somewhat unique, that there are not a lot of these style of programs connected to hospitals.
That's really sad to me. I wish it wasn't so unique, because I see the benefit of it and I see how people can thrive within it. I work in a hospital that for the most part is private. Riggs does a lot of work at trying to work with insurance companies. There's a lot of struggle there to get funding from insurance companies. Being private, they can also do what they want, which is like have a program where we can give the key to patients in a residential psychiatric hospital, which for some may seem like a big risk. But yeah, I wish it wasn't so unique. I wish it could be, I wish there was funding for it. I wish that people could realize the benefit from it. Yeah, it's sad to me that there aren't more of these programs.
Do you have any thoughts about mental illness within our society? And this is just you as someone who has worked in a hospital for a long time. I feel like that mental illness is one of those things that on one hand, there's a stigma, like if you have a mental illness that you're somehow different. But then on the other hand, there's this idea that you should be able to pull up your bootstraps and figure it out, which is, I don't think that's true. But how do you think about the prevalence of mental illness within our larger society?
Well, I think that it's more prevalent than it isn't, but it's certainly not, it's better at being recognized. Hopefully it's better at being less stigmatized. But I think, so I live in Massachusetts and I like sports, and I used to listen to Tom Brady give his Patriots Monday interview on the sports radio station, and he always talks about mental toughness, and I every week would get so mad at Tom Brady talking about mental toughness, because I think it's like that is such BS. I think that approach is awful. We're like, where are we now? Now we're, I'm not going to talk about that. It's like, but I think, there's a lot. There's just, as a person, I think there's awful stigma that gets placed on it, which is part of the problem. I think people are, as humans, it's very hard to communicate. It's very hard for us to talk about our emotions. It's hard for us to, learn to talk about our emotions instead of taking a physical action. And I work in a hospital. It's a real thing. Like, people are actually sick. I have a lot of, people who don't I don't believe in that. But, okay, that doesn't make any sense to me, but I hear that a lot. And yeah, that's frustrating and saddening to me. I think what I like about the fact of where I work is that I'm able to get to meet people for the person that they are. And that's what I encourage my students to do, is to not, don't feel like because you're, working in ceramics, that you have to feel a certain way or you have to put on a certain face. I don't work in a clinical capacity, but, if you're having a bad day, I would much rather you say, I'm not really feeling so good, than for you to try to feel like you have to act a certain way.
I started the series More Than a Maker in Mental Health Awareness Month, which there is an actual month that is, to bring awareness to these issues. But what about the other 11 months of the year?
Yeah.
Because I know with me and my family history, clinical mental illness is a big part of our family history, but there's also what I think of as almost the social impacts of mental illness, which can be, as you mentioned, like the lack of communication skills. So there's the first person experience of the mental illness, but then there's also not being able to tell or communicate with other people what you're thinking or what you're going through. I like that you could draw this parallel between there are skills you learn in clay, and no one's going to fault you because you don't know how to throw if you don't know how to throw. Same thing with the skills you might learn in communication. Like, I think sometimes we're extra hard on ourselves when we feel like we should be able to communicate what's going on internally better than we can, but it's a skill. If we don't have the skill, we don't have it. And so I think mental health is often about, how do I pick up the skills that fit the brain that I have?
Yeah. I don't think Riggs believes in cures. Mind you, I believe in this place. I've worked here for 13 years. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works, in my opinion, for the vast majority of people that I see. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't work here. And I don't say that in a way to promote Riggs. I just say that, because I think it's important. But yeah, it's about, how do you live with the person that you are? And that's a hard lesson for me. And there's a lot of aspects of who you are, whether it be, in the ceramic studio or, in other aspects of your life.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. More Than a Maker is made possible by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana, proud sponsors of Wellness for Makers. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana is focused on building healthier communities through strategic investments to improve population health, increase access to care, and to make healthcare more affordable for all. For more information, please visit bcbsmt.com. Well, this is a good transition to talk about your work and clay and how you became a potter. So how did you become the maker that you are? What were the influences that got you here?
I started making pots, I was introduced to it in college, and then I ended up out on Castle Hill. I spent a summer out on the Cape. And then I did other things because I went to college, and, it was very much of the philosophy that you go to college and you get a job. And so to not do that was like a very radical departure. Even though now it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal, but I really wasn't introduced to a different model, which I don't say critically. I just wasn't introduced to it. It seemed like a very big leap. But I also didn't like any of the other things I was doing, and I liked clay the best. So I remember there's just a point in my life where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try to just keep doing this until I can't. And I feel like I haven't gotten to that point. And so I still love being in the studio, working here. Everyone here, we're all working artists. So I have a studio outside of here. I make my own work. And for me, this is a good balance. Because, I always want to be in the studio more. There's always that desire to have like a little bit more time in the studio. I think that's true for any artist. But for me personally, I felt like my kind of skill set as a person wasn't best being utilized by only being in the studio. So I really like this balance. I'm a pretty social person. I think the thing about about working at Riggs is you have to like people. Like I feel like that's the ultimate requirement, is you really have to just be interested in people, because that's a lot of your job. So, um, yeah, so clay was kind of my favorite thing. And in all the things that I've done in my life, it still remained my favorite thing, in terms of material to work with. And I just feel really lucky that I'm actually able to work with clay every day. So whether through teaching or being in my own studio.
Can you talk about the time you spent with Mark Shapiro as an apprentice?
Yeah. So I met Mark. I was out on the Cape, being a studio manager of Castle Hill, Shapiro Center for the Arts. And Mark came through and he taught a workshop, and I was immediately impressed by both his work, but also Mark has a real presence. And I was impressed by that kind of command. And I asked if I could be his apprentice. At that time, Steve Tabarish, who's since become a very good friend of mine, studio mate of mine for about 4 years. He just built an amazing studio that he's working out of now. Steve was Mark's apprentice, and Mark was like, "No, you can't." But he kind of gave me a checklist of things to do, which was good. One of which was go to Penland, and so I did a concentration at Penland with Neil Patterson and Sandy Parentozzi, and that was amazing. That really introduced me to the American studio pottery movement. And then I asked Mark a second time, and he still said no, because I think Steve, when Steve worked with Mark, he was high school age. Steve was a total punk rocker, so he was being homeschooled and being arrested for whatever various like social activism he was doing. The first time I actually met Steve was because he was home in Northampton. He was receiving the Northampton Man of the Year award for a book exchange program that he started with the prisons. So yeah, he's a pretty amazing guy. But I was like going to convince Mark. I wasn't going to take no for an answer. I was going to be his apprentice, which is usually I'm not that forthright, but I just really wanted this thing. And I felt that for me, this was the best way for me to learn. I was not a great student in college. Maybe if I'd gone to school for clay, maybe that would be different. That's also helpful in teaching at Riggs, to kind of just knowing different teaching modalities. And, a lot of, just because of biologically when mental illness can show itself, a lot of my students are college aged. So they may have had to leave school. And so for them to come back and to work with me as a student, that title can actually be hard for them. But it can also be rewarding for them to kind of see some successes as a student, whereas they might be coming from a place where they did not. So, but my apprenticeship with Mark was, basically, to sum it up, I just tried to help Mark stay in the studio, and I would try to do the tasks that would allow him to like be at the wheel. And we had an arrangement where, the closer we got to a firing, the more I did for him. And then ultimately a firing, he has a wood kiln. That would be a labor intensive process, which would culminate with him going to a show. So I was Mark's apprentice from 2000 to 2003. So this was at a time when he would do a firing and we would go to the Baltimore Craft Fair or the Smithsonian. I mean, he was getting into good shows, and it showed me that kind of model of making and then selling your pots through a retail market, which is different now, certainly than it was then. But it was a good introduction, and also just what it looks like to actually make a living working in the studio. I had some of that when I was on Cape Cod, but this is a different model when people aren't coming to you as regularly, when you have to go to them. And I have a good relationship with Mark. We had a good relationship, I think, when I was his apprentice, and Mark has the capacity and the self-confidence to let me evolve into a potter and a person, and treat me really as an equal now. It's not important for Mark to have his apprentices, for him to maintain that relationship. He's not interested in that. He really wants all of his apprentices to be able to go out on their own and make a living and become accomplished in their own right. And he's had a really successful apprenticeship program where we are all still making pots. Yeah, it's an impressive group of people.
Yeah, I really admire him as a potter, but also as a thinker and a historian. I've interviewed him as a potter, and I've also interviewed the work he's done as a historian. And I love that he can switch effortlessly from this is how I do this handle to do you know about this person that worked in the 1800s that did this? You know, like his ability to switch, I think, is really nice. And that I think for me as a maker, having an intellectual pursuit that is outside of the studio, but that helps the studio work is really giving me some energy. Do you find that with the Austin Riggs work that you do, that fuels your own studio?
Yeah, definitely. Because my students are really amazingly intelligent and they're curious and they investigate a lot of things and they bring that energy into the studio, and I can bring that energy into my studio. And then hopefully when I'm working in my studio, I'm excited. And then hopefully when I come back to this studio, I can bring that enthusiasm. So I kind of think of it a little bit as a circle, where I certainly am absolutely influenced by the energy of my students. And I hope that I'm able to do the same back to them. Yeah. But yeah, I'm introduced to a lot more ideas by being here than I would otherwise. And not just clay, but there's other studios in the building. So it's really, it's a pretty broad spectrum. And there's a greenhouse, and there's also a preschool on campus. So it's pretty elaborate. So yeah, it's pretty great. But definitely, I think of my world as much more dynamic because of my teaching.
Can you talk about your approach to mark making on the surfaces of your pots? Because it seems like there's this idea of accumulation, like there's mark on mark on mark. So can you talk about that?
Decorating for me was something that I always wanted to do, but it was so hard. Change can come slow for me in my work. So it took me a while to kind of figure out, and, basically all my decorating is essentially is Mishima or inlay with either an X-Acto knife or a sheetrock screw. Those are kind of my two tools that I like to go to. And I work in a lot of different clays. I work with porcelain, definitely, and then I'll use various stonewares, which when I'm doing marks, I'll just cover the whole pot in wax first. And I think the first thing that caught my attention was a Japanese woodcut of a fishing net. And I think that was when I just started at Riggs. My email address at Riggs is a .net email address. And I think there was something about that I liked. And it was these kind of swirly lines. So I think over time, I think when I first made them, I tried to make them pretty exacting. And then over time, they became much more abstract. And I think they are also slightly about, I think there's a metaphor of a net and the things we catch and the things we kind of hold on to. And I think there's some metaphor of repetition and kind of behaviors, human behavior and behavior patterns. And I think that's certainly true in my own life. And just kind of thinking about behavior and the things we do and the people we are and the things that we repeat or the cycles we try to break. So I think metaphorically it came from those places, and it just came from a desire to just want to do more to the surface of my work.
One of the things I've seen recently is more color, like expanding your color palette, but you're firing in a wood kiln. So I don't necessarily think in my mind like, okay, wood kiln, it's going to be colorful.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. Like I can show you some really nice pots that look like they came out of a cone 6 electric kiln that I instead spent, 22 hours firing in my wood kiln. So yeah, a kiln is a tool, right? All these things are tools, and we can use them however we want. You can make the wheel go really fast, or you can make the wheel go really slow. And our aesthetics change, like we change. And so I think my aesthetic to wood-fired pots changed. And yeah, I wanted to have more color in my work. So a couple things happened. One is that I built a kiln that's actually hard to fire. It isn't now, but at first it was. And so I realized that, if I fired a cone 6, that's going to save me like 4 hours. So I just decided to do that, which allowed me to introduce some more color. And then I also changed how I fire my kiln, in that I fire a lot more neutral, bordering on oxidized. But it's still really important for me to fire my kiln, to fire a wood kiln. Like, I love to fire my wood kiln. I wish I could fire my kiln more. I mean, that's always something I'm trying to sort out, is just how often I fire. And yeah, my aesthetic just it geared for the work that I'm making. It shifted away a little bit than what people would think about, if what people would think when they think about wood-fired pots. It's not that I don't like those pots. It's just that my aesthetic changed. But I still really believe in wood firing. Where I live, that's how the pots here were made. It ties me to the place. I like the process. I like the group of people I fire with. Switching to cone 6 was actually this unexpected result, was that it opened up. A lot more people fire to cone 6 than they do to cone 10. So it opened up this whole other group of people who are surprised when I invite them to fire with me. They're like, "Oh, you fired a cone 6?" I'm like, "Yeah, fired a cone 6." I mean, really, my kiln goes to cone 8. It just depends on where it is. But yeah, it introduced a whole different group of people. Which was really wonderful.
Many decades ago, I was a little baby wood firer, and my teachers would say, like, you can't put cobalt in a wood kiln. It's like you were going to hex the kiln or something. But there's a lot of cobalt. There's some copper. It looks like in your glazes. So there's some idea that you're not being held to the expectation of wood firing because you're thinking of it as a different way. And I think that's really nice when people see a tool and they think, well, how do I make what I want to make with this tool, not what has everyone else made with this tool?
Yeah, I also built this kiln. So I have a kiln. It's a cat built on a rectangle, basically, and my fireboxes are not. I have 2 fireboxes, so it's essentially like a downdraft kiln. And my thinking was, I'm going to build this kiln, and it's going to be easier to load because I don't have to deal with the arch. It's also the back arch, and also it's going to be more uniform firing instead of a cross draft, because I was firing cross drafts. And I think really I built it because I knew how to fire cross drafts. And I think it was so important for me to get away from my apprenticeship. I still wanted to wood fire, but I didn't want to do everything the way Mark did it. So it was a little bit of like whiny stubbornness, because this kiln, economically, it makes much less sense, because my second firebox could be pots. Like, all that infrastructure could hold pots, but it doesn't. It holds a second firebox. And essentially I'm firing 2 kilns because I got 2 fireboxes, which I'm always like panicked, like nobody's going to want to fire my kiln with me, which hasn't happened yet. I have a great crew of people, and people still want to fire with me, and we get some really beautiful pots out of it. But yeah, just what I wanted to do with it has changed over time, and hopefully that will continue. I have a good friend, Jeffrey Lipton, who was he was one of Mark's apprentices, and he's doing cone 1 earthenware, and we keep talking about let's do a cone 1 wood firing. So there's a lot of things we can do, and hopefully we can get the time to do them.
Well, to wrap up, can you talk about Hilltown 6, about the group, and also just building community in Western Massachusetts?
Yeah, there are a lot of really good potters out here in Western Massachusetts, it turns out. And I feel like there's kind of more coming over the years. More people have come to this area, which is exciting to be a part of that community. So Hilltown 6, I think it's 15 years old. I'm not quite sure. We have a name that's confusing, but we sound like a bunch of bandits or something. But originally there were 6 of us. We've never now there are 9 host potters. The tour, it's a self-guided tour. So it's this year, it's at the end of July, I think July 23rd, 24th is the Hilltown 6 Pottery Tour. And we invite you to come out and see our studios and see where we work and make the pots. It was a way for us potters in Western Mass to do something together and to build some community, because so often we are, as many of us artists are, working alone in our studio. So how do we do an event together? So that was the idea. And I personally, I'd always rather go to somebody's studio. I think it makes sense to see the pots and where they're made and the setting that they're made. And I just like to see people's setups and see, we're all such good problem solvers as artists. So there's so much to learn. So yeah, we've been doing it for, I think, 15 years, and it's a super fun event. I think it's great. Again, I like to meet people. I love it when I can meet new people and interact. I think it's important to always stand in front of your work. Also, where I work at Riggs, we have a gallery in the front. We have a storefront space, and I can help students have a show, which is so hard to go through that process. So it's important for me to go through that process too, and to put my work together, and also think about, like, what am I going to do this year? Do I want to just make a bunch of pots, or is there something I'm working on? Is there a theme? So it's important to do that.
And it's also just so beautiful. Like your guys' part of Massachusetts, I've driven around those back roads, and it's just amazing, actually.
Yeah, it is. I agree with that. And we're starting to get there again. I think winters are beautiful too, but these past couple of weeks with everything in bloom, it's pretty beautiful here. And it's surprising. I grew up in Albany. I lived on Cape Cod for a while, and I would drive by, but I never stopped. I never really went to Western Massachusetts until I came here. So where we are is probably 2 hours west of Boston and maybe about 3.5 hours kind of due north of New York City, depending on traffic. And yeah, we're in the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. So it's, not quite as hilly as, say, like North Carolina. The hills are spread out more, but it's quite amazingly beautiful. There's not, the cities, we're in between a couple cities, and there's no real jobs in between. So, where we live hasn't changed much. A little different the past couple of years with people moving out here, but it's amazingly beautiful.
Can you plug the website for that so people can find out more information?
It's hilltown6.com. And the 6 is the number 6. So hilltown6.com. And on the website, we have all the host potters. We have a bunch of guest potters. My guest potter this year will be David Eichelberger, which is super exciting. He lives really close to me, but it's one of these things where I have to invite him to come down to get to see him. So yeah, he's up in, I think he's in Brattleboro, Vermont. He might be Putney, Vermont. But yeah, so there's a bunch of guest potters and some 2D artists as well. So it's always a really, it's always an amazing weekend. Yeah, it's really fun.
Well, thanks for taking the time to do this, man. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, it's great to talk to you. So I appreciate the podcast. I was talking about it with some coworkers and just telling them what you've done for the ceramist community, and because they have not, no offense, but they have not heard of Tales of the Red Clay Rambler. But I'm like, it's really important. Ben has done a lot for the ceramist community, and you really have. So you've really, let people into their processes, which is a nice opportunity to be able to do. And as a listener, it's great to kind of hear what people are thinking about and doing in their studios, and also these more recent podcasts that you have been doing that have been expanding those and different ways of thinking and about the material. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Well, thanks, man.
Yep.
I'd like to thank Michael for taking the time to do this interview. I enjoyed connecting with him and hearing about his work at the Austin Riggs Center. Also wanted to take a minute to thank Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana for sponsoring the More Than a Maker series. They've been investing in the mental health of Montanans through a variety of initiatives. You can find out more about that at bigblueskyinitiativemt.com. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.